and welcome back to another episode of Scuttlebutt, the official podcast of the National Museum of the Surface Navy. We're here in the Associated Foundation's Training Center, sponsored by Barry Herlihy. And once again, we're sort of recording this the week before the HENSA conference, so everybody's off kind of prepping, and we're down from the usual crew. We've just got me, that would be Marianne Fengler. I'm the producer. We've got Mike Getcher, the COO, and all the fancy things in his title.
Chief Knucklehead.
And then we've got our curatorial department with us again. We have Dave Way, our historian and curator, and Jim Kurrasch, did I say it right? Who is kind of like most of us around here, does all the things. So last time we talked about artifacts in general. Today we're going to talk about artifact number 1.
That's it. So artifact, actually stepping back for a moment, when you have a collection of artifacts, you actually number them, and they literally start at number 1 and number 2 and so on to many thousands perhaps. And you accession them. That's a museum term for accepting them into the collection in a formal way. And so here we are. Artifact number 1 is in fact an 887-foot, 45,800-ton current displacement vessel from first commission in 1943. Right. So artifact number 1 is the ship. It is the Iowa. It's just like having a collection.
So as a joke, when I first became the curator, I printed out a fake barcode, 001, 00001, and I put up in the top 1 Iowa class battleship.
Nice.
And it's still up there today. It's in our office, and I smacked it up on the bulkhead.
It's funny.
There you go.
You can get you a QR code for her now.
Right. No, I need to come up with the latest technology.
Come on, step into the 21st century.
Oh, jeez, I know.
So artifact number 1, if you think about a collection, you have to kind of understand how do you take care of a collection. You have perhaps a smaller item, an artifact. I'm trying to think of something. Maybe you're thinking of
a photo or a pencil. We lost
the Queen of England, yesterday or 2. Was it yesterday or 2 days ago?
2 days ago.
2 days ago. But thinking about some of the artifacts they have in their collection, whether it's a crown or the jewels or whatever, and you're trying to preserve or conserve it. You're trying to keep it in its original state, because it's a priceless or considered a priceless artifact. But people don't live in the crown. I'm not being silly here either. I mean, it's not an office building. It's not really where you work either. Certainly the castle would be considered that. But how do you deal with that? How do you maintain its integrity and its relationship to its original form while actually using the ship? So the ship is kind of interesting, and I'll never forget this. When we first received the ship, September 6th of 2011, sometime in the next few weeks, I remember hearing either through Facebook or some other group, well, gee, are you going to restore it back to World War II configuration? And what an odd question it is to us, but it's not to most people because they don't quite understand. They look at the ship as being first and foremost an artifact from World War II, but in fact it was in the fleet nominally for 50 years, actually active for 19 plus years, and it spanned 3 different eras. The World War II era, of course, under which it was built. And then the Korean War era, nominally from 51 to 58, if my numbers are correct.
Right.
Yeah. Yep. And then it came back in the 80s in what we call the Cold War era. And so it has these 3 very distinct, very unique experiences in history. And how do you respect all of that? If you're going to just return it back to World War II configuration, first off, bring a big checkbook of, I'm going to pull out of my hat $400 million. Plus all the artifacts are gone. The extra guns that were taken off, the bunks are gone, the ship has been modified. And so that's it's an interesting thing to talk about. These ships, literally from the first day they were launched, were modified. They were changed. A bulkhead was changed. The door was added. New features were added into the suite. I don't think, Dave, you can probably comment on this too. Literally within months, they were changing the anti-aircraft suite for the ship.
Right. The configuration changed even in World War II.
Right. And so these ships, even during World War II, you look at a ship in 1942 and it looked one way, and by 1945, if it survived, many did, that it looked dramatically different.
Right.
And that kind of speaks to something that I kind of did when I first came here as the operations guy. Was, I treated it like a ship model. And I've been a ship modeler, or just a modeler all my life. I play with trains too. It's a different illness, but ship models, and I do them even here, and they're fun. And so when you start to build ships, you have to decide pretty much what day of its life are you going to represent. How do you do that? And so after, sometime in that first year, I remember having a conversation with you, Dave. We had the best pictures from about 1988.
Sure.
A wonderful range of color photographs of the ship in Norfolk at that time, and really a good graphical record of what she looked like. And so we've nominally chosen that, yes, this is the ship we have. It's a 1988-ish version of it, and we're going to restore her as much as we physically can to that time frame. And I don't know of other ships that have done that. They've actually struggled with, what do you do? I've heard of at least one other ship wanting to remove a very significant feature just to reflect just a very small portion of the ship back to an earlier era. And it's an interesting conversation. There's an ethos behind this that you have to decide as an institution or as an organization. I have been institutionalized, but I don't know. Do you have any comments on that? Actually, from both of you, it's kind of an interesting thing.
Well, doubling back to people's desire to return the ship back to World War II configuration, they pulled 4 twin 5-inch gun mounts back aft to add the Harpoon and Tomahawk missiles and rebuilt the aft superstructure. Then at one point in time, they had 52 20-millimeter guns on board.
How many?
52.
Whoa.
And how many quad 40s?
And 19 quad 40 millimeters. You're right. And so, as you know, we've went out to just find one of a 20 millimeter or 40 millimeter gun to put on display. We haven't been able to really find a complete, gun just to share that with the visitors. So you can see the difficulty. They also had catapults back aft for the float planes with a big crane. Well, you'd have to produce those. Those aren't laying around in some scrapyard or some naval-based weapon station.
Yeah, there's only one. To my knowledge, there's only one extant catapult. It's on the Alabama, and I don't even think it's a BB or battleship catapult. I think it's a CB, a battlecruiser. But yeah, it's a challenging problem. One thing too, if you're going to backdate it, I can get that, and you can maybe do that with certain artifacts. I mean, some of the like aircraft, like a B-17 that was modified for fire use, so you can maybe backdate it back to its original configuration, and that's a legitimate decision. It's a discussion point, but for this, it's very, very difficult.
Right.
You can't just do that, and you're also kind of disrespecting potentially the other two eras, and you have crews associated with each one of those eras,
right.
And so it's tough.
Yeah, some of the other battleships, they only participated in World War II, so they're fortunate that that's all they have to represent and talk about. They weren't in the Korean War, let alone Vietnam or the Cold War, and we have 3 eras. And then if you look at the New Jersey, she was off Vietnam as well. She has 4 eras to talk about or maybe share with the public.
And each time she was brought into service, she was in a slightly different configuration, most heavily modified in the 80s. I don't think they did too much for Vietnam on New Jersey, but still, I mean, it's they're always changing.
That's right. Today's ships are always incorporating the latest weaponry and communications, electronic warfare, maybe minor upgrades on the engines and whatever else. Absolutely.
There's an awful lot of World War II still here, Jim. I mean, you've talked about that too. You've seen it down in the engine rooms and stuff. We joke about it being a big stick shift. Yeah. You really have to drive this thing like an old-fashioned car.
Yep. Manual choke.
There you go.
It's amazing to wander around the ship. Mike, that I'm a sucker for machinery nameplates. I like that kind of stuff. I like seeing who built things because pieces of the ship came from all over the country, many, many different companies. But the technology on the ship has, of course, had to keep up and evolve with the changing missions as the ship has served in different eras. And, frankly, I'm glad I wasn't part of the original crew in Richmond, having to go through those difficult choices that you guys had to go through, trying to decide how to portray the ship. But the solution that you came up with was eminently the most practical, to pick an 80s configuration. And we had to do some things. We had to mock up some equipment that was gone from the ship because a lot of the weapon systems on the ship are still in use in the fleet today. And so equipment that was on the ship was repurposed for different things is still out in the fleet and had to be replaced in some way or other. We've alluded to combat engagement, where one of our guys, Bill McNally, has done a tremendous job finding equipment to repopulate that space because so many of the pieces were removed from there when the ship was laid up in the reserve fleet. But yeah, it's amazing to think of the ship in the 40s configuration. And one of the things that impressed me is you really did need 2,700 hands on this ship because so much of the weapon systems involved manual operations, manual loading, manual handling, manual clipping. A lot of guys shagging equipment and materials and supplies around to make this ship operate. And, I'm still uncovering pieces of this. We got a trove recently of well over 5,500 scans of drawings for the ship. And going through that, I'm uncovering things like, how did the hoists for the 20 millimeter and 40 millimeter ammunition work back in the 1940s? Because I've never seen one. They're not here anymore. Or if the trunks are still there, they're blanked off and there's nothing in them. So fascinating little stories like that are beginning to surface here. And it's just great being part of all that discovery.
Yeah, we're always learning and exploring stuff here. And so behind that, we've, I think, established our ethos as an organization about how we restore, how do we preserve things, because it's difficult. Once again, getting back to that not so great analogy of a crown, you can't live in it. We actually live and work aboard the vessel, number one artifact. And so how do you make it practical and do things that actually are helpful for now, while respecting that original integrity, and as we call it in the museum world, the original fabric. And there's a real challenge. I'll point out one thing, for example, we've got 3 elevators aboard the ship. And one of them is in the location of the elevator that was put aboard for FDR when he was aboard the ship in 43. And the other 2 are located back aft, but we decided to integrate them into the vessel structure in such a way that they don't look like they're out of place. So we're trying to do things that are respectful while making modifications that are helpful to our guests and to allow people to really experience the ship.
It's functionality, really.
Yeah,
you
need that.
Right.
We're actually using a lot of systems aboard the ship, whether it's the sewage system, the water system. I'm in plans literally right now.
The air conditioning.
System. We're ramping back up, and so we can use a lot of that original fabric once again, and try not to modify things too much, integrate things into the ship in such a way that they don't look out of place. That's important to us. Even to the choice of watertight doors we choose for for the heads or the restrooms back aft. We try to make them look like they belong here.
Right.
That's really important to us. But back to the ethos, one of the things that we established early on, it was Jonathan, I think, that articulated it first, was if it's a truly unique space aboard the ship or truly unique thing, let's leave it alone. Let's preserve it. Let's restore it. A couple of examples would be the CEC, and Bill found amazing equipment. I'll never forget the day that he found the electronic countermeasures console in a junkyard in Anaheim, California.
Yes.
It had been, gutted of all the whatever sensitive equipment it might have had, but the console was there, and that was perfectly good for us. Just amazing how he picked that up.
Right.
And we're trying to get those SPA 25 units back, and so we'll restore it to its last configuration.
Exactly.
And there's a handful of pieces still missing up there. We've got the Harpoon consoles, most of the Tomahawk consoles, but you're actually fabricating some things because you can't just go out anywhere normally and find this stuff. Another story would be the plot rooms, for gunnery. Those were largely an original configuration. They had a few changes from the 80s. They had a SPA 25, like a radar repeater type device that was in there. But we had one piece that was missing, and it was a fascinating thing, a great story for us. And little known, I think, the plot gear for the most part down there is all 1943-ish. Ford Instruments, the Mark 8s, the Mark 1 Ables, all that kind of stuff. And the switch gear is largely original. But in the 1950s, post-Korean War, where the main mission of the battleship was shore bombardment, they developed the Mark 48 bombardment computer. And we had one missing. We never did find out. I think it was serial number 13, Lucky 13. I don't remember. But we never did figure out where it went. These machines were rare. As I understand it, they were only developed for the big gun cruisers and the battleships. And so there would have been no more than 20, 30, 40, if that, made, probably only 20 or 30. They were integrated into the ships in the mid-50s, and we had a missing one. And there was one back east at a museum. It was de-accessioned. We've spoken about accessioning before. And one of our friends on the East Coast called me up one day and said, Mike, you need a 48? It's like, yes. And he goes, come get it. And
so one of those phone calls again.
Like, holy cow. And it's kind of the magic of both the industry and the friendships and the relationships and also just of the ship itself. There's always a interest in doing that.
Well, then you talk about, too, the way we use the ship. It was absolutely incredible watching that thing go back into the space because we used all the equipment down there. Yeah. We lowered it down a hatch. We used the I-beam on Broadway, put it in the space in 3 different pieces with clearances, I kid you not, maybe 1.5 inches, 2 inches to slide it around the corner, and it's all reassembled in there, and it looks incredible.
Yeah, we pulled off the soft patch is what they're called, a big opening on the side of the plot room. It was down on Broadway. Once again, 3 pieces. I think the total weight of the thing was 2,800 pounds, and broken apart, the heaviest piece was 1,200.
Yeah.
And we had to get it down 3 decks to there, and then through this circuitous path, just to get in there. And extraordinary team, and across the department boundaries too. The ops team and the technology team was down there, and just really kind of cool. Great story, epic journey from the East Coast. Really fun. We picked it up in the snow in Fall River, Massachusetts, and literally left there, and the snow didn't fall off the truck until Tennessee.
And there's a list underneath. If anybody ever takes it out again, they're going to find a list of people who were involved in moving that thing back in there, which is pretty cool.
But getting back to the core subject, we're trying to restore those unique spaces. And there's a lot of uniqueness aboard the ship, so you don't mess with those areas. The galley is unique, the main galley, and we're trying to preserve all of that. The CPO galley is largely functional, not entirely. We don't want to just remove things just because it would be convenient. We're trying to restore the library. There's only one library aboard the ship. There's only one film studio now being restored too up there.
Right.
So those unique spaces are really important. And over time on these ships, and I've spoken to this, and I'm trying not to pick on other institutions. In fact, I'm not going to use the name of the vessel. There's a vessel not too far away that, by many reports, has perhaps only 60% of its original fabric there. Even huge machinery has been removed. I mean, literally almost all the machinery. Deck machinery has been removed. It's from a museum perspective, a shadow of what it was. There's still core features that are wonderful, but we're trying not to do that. That's important to us. But it also begs the question about other modifications. We have to have space, and if you have a space that you have 100 of, then what do you do? Is that open for discussion and potential, change? And in fact, that's the accepted ethos that we have here. But you guys have been a part of our discussion here for quite a while. We've decided, of course, with the National Museum of the Surface Navy to open up as much as 20 to 30,000 square feet of space, all of it berthing space, and even that has some angst for us. We think about it, and it's important for us to preserve as much of the ship as we can, and yet we need some space. So after deciding that you can only show our guests so many bunks before their eyes glaze over, we've decided to go ahead and open up some of those spaces for use, and it's both been hard, I think, for the crew and even for the former crew members too, but also
definitely.
Interesting too. You guys have found just tons of stuff in the bunks and underneath them. Can you share some of that?
Yeah. So just the articles of everyday life that give you an idea of what the guys were doing day to day. Lots and lots of hair combs and hair picks, which were pretty common in the 1980s. I knew guys who had hair picks. Ballpoint pens, many of them. Playing cards.
Tons
Coins.
Of playing cards.
And then there are interesting little slices of life, like a big stack of letters that a guy had been getting from his honey and saving. And the last one in the stack was a Dear John letter.
Oh.
And I can well imagine that he had been carefully saving this stack, and then that letter came in, and he just tossed the whole thing over the back, and it stayed hidden there behind those bunks until we ripped them out these many years later.
Wow.
Yeah, there's all kinds of interesting things. Go ahead.
We wound up with about 4 medium-sized boxes full of all these items, and there's Ford coins and souvenirs or guide booklets from their deployments
Shore
in foreign ports,
excursions,
shore excursions,
yeah.
exactly,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So it's been really just like a slice of that.
We
that
had
era.
we had one of the guys that from the 80s crew that was here on April 19th, and he was looking around
Right.
through his old bunk and found one of the boxes, and he's like, "Can I look at it?" And I said, "Yeah, go ahead." And he's going through, and he finds these two pictures of two different girls, and they're both
remember it.
addressed to the same guy on the back, and he's like, "I know who this is." So
Right.
he
Yeah.
got the guy the
Yeah.
copies of the pictures or something
Right.
like that.
Yeah, I scanned those, and
Yeah.
then one of our Dave Canfield sent them off
Yeah.
to the guy.
Yeah, that's cool. That's a neat connection that
Yeah.
you can find.
Yeah, exactly. That
You
was
find-
that was fun.
You find some odd things too, and you find the occasional condom.
Right. Oh,
I think in a package, I hope. But
Oh God.
in pictures of girls and things like that, it's just normal
Right.
Navy life
Sure,
at the time.
exactly.
So, but yeah, taking these spaces apart is difficult emotionally for some people. And
It is.
It's not something we take lightly. We think about it. We're being very cautious right now. We're not going back. Of course, there's a whole history around our Tour 2 world, the loss of 47 sailors in 1989. And so any of their bunks or their belongings or things of their time aboard vessel are going to be very carefully preserved, and very much their memory is precious to us. But we're trying to be thoughtful, trying to go through it and make it make sense. But we need the space too. We need to be able to interest those people, make this institution and the ship and the history of the Navy relevant to a younger generation. And that takes space to do that. I don't want this to be 30 years from now a beautifully restored, completely uninteresting bunk area that really hasn't helped the organization at all. So it's a difficult discussion.
right. And I know we've talked about at one point picking a compartment and going back to the World War II Korean War era of the canvas pole.
That'd be cool.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
that's
And we've been offered some original canvas bunks.
Right.
You mentioned either was it this podcast or the other one, that some of these ships, I think it was this one a few minutes ago, they only sailed during World War II. They were in commission, like my dad's ship, from 1942 to 1946. Had a minor refit after the war, and then they were just decommed. They were
Right.
done. That was the extent of their world.
Sure.
So they're kind of a still life, of 1940s life aboard a vessel. And the North Carolina is another great example. The Alabama is one.
Yeah, exactly.
They only had that one period that they need to represent or that they can represent. And so that's it. In some ways it seems easier.
Yeah, I would
It's
say
much
so.
more difficult to reflect
Yeah.
the nation. For Jim, when we walk into an engineering space, even down in the engine rooms, you'll find that most of it is original. You'll find a handful of things. I think there was a joke in the 80s about the ship was rebuilt from the main deck up. Not entirely true, but it was kind of their joke. But down there you'll find some new alarm systems and some new communication equipment, but otherwise original 1940s stuff. There's a lot of 1940s here.
Very much so. And, a good example of that is anchor windlass, too, which is exactly 1940s configuration. I was involved somewhat in cleaning up that space, and we put a lot of work into it, and it's an ongoing process. I go in there periodically and clean up oil leaks because all the equipment still works, and
Yeah.
it still leaks oil.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I know. I'm the last guy to operate it, so I know it works. And I've been scared in there more than once.
Right.
Really a challenge. There's so many valves, you just have to get the thing aligned. We are, to this time frame at least, the last crew in history to anchor a battleship. And then sometime here, I want to say this year, I'm going to crank it up, at least one of them, because I want to undog the portside anchor, the windlass itself. And then we've talked about lowering the starboard anchor down so you can paint it a little bit closer to the water line, so a little bit easier. Where it's housed right now, it's kind of hard to paint. That was the last anchor pulled up in Sassoon Bay. So there's a whole story behind that. But yeah, the stuff works. And there's a few problems in there too, because I've had a lot of smoke and flame in there that scared the crap out of me. I don't want to repeat that again.
Well, I think it's terrific that, still on board Iowa, like both battery plot rooms are almost totally intact, I believe. All
And
four.
they're so pristine. They're just
Yeah.
kind of the best
Yeah.
preserved spaces on the ship.
Yeah. All four fire rooms, boiler rooms, and the engine rooms are totally intact. And from the Navy running the dehumidification gear for the most part over the last 21 years in the reserve fleet, the interior of the ship is just very pristine.
We are very blessed.
We definitely, we're very blessed to receive the ship in that condition.
Yeah.
Yeah, we benefited in many ways from having the ship be well cared for because it was still, even for the first handful of years, in a kind of a reserve status.
Right.
So they were more careful, I think, with this than they were some of the older vessels that were ultimately discarded.
Sure.
In fact, some of those older vessels had all kinds of issues. In fact, frankly, just comparatively speaking, and I'll think of the Massachusetts, which is my dad's ship. They were rated for parts, for a long time. These ships, when they're donated to an institution or an organization, there's a contract that goes with it. And the contract says that the Navy can come back and take anything they want off of it, value to them, and they can take back the ship if they need it. That's basically the contract. Pretty simple words for, 10 or 12-page contract. But, sadly, some of the plot rooms are completely, not gutted, but just, they're
empty.
Empty. There's the Massachusetts only recently got another Mark I Able. They didn't have any in one of their plot rooms at all because those units were still in use in the 70s, and that ship was donated in, I want to say, 65 or 66. So well into the 70s, some of the old DDs still had them. Wow. And so they lost those parts because the Navy says, hey, I need them. And in fact, when these ships were recommissioned in the 80s, they went back and rated those ships for parts and tools.
Right.
And I've heard hundreds of tons came off the Massachusetts. I found bore gauges down below in our ordnance storeroom from my dad's ship, and tools from the North Carolina and from the Alabama. It's amazing how they were still useful to the Navy up through late 80s. But sadly for them, they're missing some of their stuff now too.
Sure.
There's not much I would return back now to either of those ships that would really be helpful. Some of the big stuff is just gone.
Right.
The plot room stuff, for example, and they're like hen's teeth. They're incredibly rare. You just can't find that stuff. So it's a challenge. But we'd like to make our ship, work for us for the organization to make sure that it's sustainable. And so there's that balance that we have of trying to maintain the integrity of how it looks and what it should be, as well as make it useful for the organization. And that's a difficult discussion to have. And have you had any conversations with the crew about that, Jim?
Oh, yeah, we talk about that. I think we all feel the same conflict, the same angst. In one sense, we'd like to not touch the ship at all. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, we recognize that we need to maintain the museum as relevant to the public, a place that is welcoming and a place that people can come and learn new things, because we're here in Southern California with a lot of attractions around us. And as our president has realized and communicated with us, you have to change to survive. You need to maintain the organization in a fresh state that people want to come and visit.
And that's really the key. We want to be here 30, 40, 50 years from now, both physically, the ship itself, and also as an organization. Yeah. So that's it.
All right. Well, thank you guys once again for stopping by and bringing such interesting stuff to the table.
Lots of stories.
Probably have you back another time.
I'd love to. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So as usual, questions, feedback, whatever you want to talk to, topics that you want to hear us talk about, podcast@labattleship.com. Thanks again for listening, and we will talk at you again soon.